Two men die in a car crash and arrive at the pearly gates at exactly the same time. There is a huge line of people waiting to get in. Finally, they get to the head of the line where St. Peter stands with a clipboard. The poor old saint looks absolutely exhausted. "Hey, fellas," he says, "sorry to keep you waiting, but it's been busier than hell up here. So let me check my list." He examines some papers and then shakes his head. "I'm really sorry, guys, but I've only got room for one more. Tell me, which one of you is more humble?" Talk about damned if you do, damned if you don't. But that, of course, is part of the trick with humility. The minute you start thinking you're humble, you're not. As Richard Foster writes, the more we pursue humility, the more distant it becomes. To think we have it is sure evidence that we don't. Clearly, we as Christians are called to humility. We are called to let go of self-righteous pride, and we are also called to let go of false self-denigration. But how do you do that? And maybe we can learn something from our gospel reading this morning, the well-known parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, or as you may remember it from childhood, the Pharisee and the publican. To begin with, this story is told in a confrontational context. Jesus, writes Luke, told this parable to some who trusted themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Or as Eugene Peterson paraphrases it, he told his next story to some who were complacently pleased with themselves over their moral behavior and looked down their noses at the common people. In other words, Jesus told this story expecting that his audience wouldn't like it. He didn't think that they would stand up and salute when he told them the tale. He expected them to be irritated. He wanted them to be irritated. But he also hoped his words would get under some skin and maybe prompt a real change in attitude and behavior. Jesus speaks of two men, one of whom his listeners would have instantly identified with, one of whom they would have seen as the good guy. The second, they would have seen as the bad guy. The good guy, the one in the white hat, is a Pharisee. He fasts far more often than the Jewish law required. He is seen at the temple on a regular basis, and he tithes 10% of all he owns for those in need. In modern terms, he doesn't just go to church on Sundays. He serves on 3 committees. He makes a very generous pledge, thank you. He ushers every other week. He shows up anytime the doors are open, and he even invites the pastor to dinner once in a while. He is considered a pillar of the community. He's an outstanding example of what commitment to the church really means. Indeed, he is someone to be emulated. But there's one problem. Yes, he's good, but he knows it. He is an arrogant son of a gun. God, he prays, I thank you that I am not like other people, adulterers, thieves, and this tax collector. You can almost picture him spitting on the ground in disgust. Now, don't be confused. The tax collector is no saint. In that day, tax collectors in Palestine served as agents of the oppressive Roman government. They often squeezed their fellow citizens dry. They not only collected the required taxes for Rome, but they skimmed as much more as they possibly could. They were dishonest thieves and greedy crooks, taking advantage of their station to make themselves rich. As one scholar writes, they were franchisees of a corrupt and Byzantine system that gouged the poor and enriched the wealthy. This tax collector, though, he seems to be a bit different. He seems to have recognized the problem of his own greed. He seems to have recognized that he's a cheat. He has realized that what he is doing is not only unfair, it is vile. God, he cries out, have mercy on me, a sinner. Now, those first hearers of the story, those who were complacently pleased with themselves, most likely identified with the first guy, with the Pharisee. He's a good man. Look at what he does for his community. Look at how often he fasts. We need more guys like him around here. And the tax collector? Well, we all know about tax collectors, traitors to the cause, flunkies for Caesar and the Roman hierarchy, cheats, liars, just awful. But Jesus has a surprise for them. I tell you, he says of the tax collector, this man went to his home justified rather than the Pharisee. What? Cry his listeners. There must be a mistake. The tax collector is the one God looks on. The tax collector is the one God looks on with favor? How can that be? He's such a slime ball. The Pharisee, now there's the one that God ought to embrace. Nope, says Jesus. Nope, it's the tax collector. That's the one who gains God's favor. For all who exalt themselves, all who puff themselves up, all who brag, like the Pharisee who keeps bragging on his own accomplishments, those folks will be humbled. But all who humble themselves, like the tax collector who honestly confronts his own wrongdoing, those are the ones who will be exalted. Look, it's not that Jesus didn't care about fasting and tithing and showing up for worship. Yes, those are all very good things, things that should be part of our lives, part of our routine. But what really counts in the end, he's saying, what really counts is our attitude about ourselves and our attitude about others. Do we see ourselves as God's gift to humanity? No, nobody here would say that, but do you see yourself as God's gift to your family? I'm the one who holds this family together. Do you see yourself as God's gift to the church? They couldn't function if I wasn't there. Do you see yourself as God's gift to your place of employment? What if I took vacations like everybody else? Do we relentlessly promote our own self-image? Do we see ourselves as better than others? How do we talk about our neighbors down the street who maybe don't keep their lawn up the way we think a lawn ought to be kept up? After all, it's in the HOA rules. Do we see ourselves in such a way? Or are we honest in our self-assessment? Do we recognize our own flaws and limitations? Well, at the same time, acknowledging our strengths and gifts. Jesus isn't suggesting here that we constantly be beating up on ourselves. Humility is not about self-abasement. Benedictine nun Joan Chittister offers a very helpful definition. Humility, she writes, is not a false rejection of God's gifts. No, it is the admission of those gifts and the acknowledgement that I have been given them for others. Humility, she writes, is reality to the full. Humility is reality to the full. Telling this story, of course, is rather dangerous for Jesus, not just because it riles up his enemies, which it does, but also because he runs the very real risk of being seen as a hypocrite. As one modern preacher writes, how does one preach on humility without succumbing to spiritual pride? God help me if I think this is the best sermon I've ever given. But you see, Jesus does not succumb. Indeed, he is a model of true humility. For Jesus understands his limitations and his gifts, and he uses those gifts for the benefit of others. He has an honest and realistic self-understanding. He knows that ultimately he is not in charge. God is. With Jesus, what you see, what you hear is what you get. He is truly humble. It won't be long before the familiar red kettles of the Salvation Army appear on sidewalks across the street as funds are collected for their vital work with the poor. The Army is so ubiquitous here in America that we forget it started out as a tiny little movement in Great Britain in the 19th century. Back in those early days, American Methodist minister Samuel Logan Brengle heard about the fledgling organization and felt called to join William and Catherine Booth in their efforts to meet the needs of the down and out. So Brengle resigned his position, packed up his belongings, and headed to England in a time when a transatlantic crossing was no easy feat. At first, Booth, who was in charge of the organization, had some real reservations about Brengle. You see, Brengle had always worked on his own. He had been a solo pastor. He'd always been independent. Booth wasn't sure he'd fit into the tightly organized, hierarchical structure of the Salvation Army. But he decided to give him a chance. One of the first things he had Brengle do was polish the boots of the other members. Brengle was less than thrilled by this lowly assignment. Have I followed my own fancy across the Atlantic in order to black boots? He wondered. But then an image crossed his mind. An image of Jesus washing the feet of the disciples. Lord, he prayed, if you can wash their feet, I can black their boots. Brengel did fit in. And his great contribution to the Salvation Army is legendary in that organization. In time, he served as the first American commissioner of the Corps, the highest office in a single nation. He even had the exalted title of Special Spiritual Ambassador. But Brengel never forgot the lesson of the boots. He never forgot the need to be humble. Keep in the will of God, he once said when asked to sum up his approach to life. Obey God. Seek God daily, waiting at his gates. Read the Bible regularly. Never neglect secret prayer. Keep testifying to the grace bestowed upon you. Help others. How do you stay humble? How do you avoid self-righteous pride or false self-denigration? Like so much else in the Christian life, the answer rests in following the example set by Jesus, who humbled himself and yet who was exalted. If you keep in the will of God, if you follow the way of Jesus, if you seek after ever deeper knowledge of God's will and of that way, if you constantly strive to help others, then St. Peter won't have to ask if you're humble. It will be patently obvious. Amen. It was my job to polish my father's shoes. They were black, shiny Oxfords that he only wore when he preached on Sunday mornings or when he did a wedding or a funeral. And so it was my task to make sure that they were not only spotless, but that you could literally see yourself in the shine. Dad was a perfectionist, so they had to be done right. I don't know if Dad was trying to teach me a lesson or just wanted his shoes polished, or probably both. But that Saturday morning ritual did teach me a lesson. It taught me a lesson that I've struggled to place into my life for 60 years now. Humility is not easy. I'd love to tell you I do it better than anybody. But it doesn't work that way. This week, I encourage you to consciously look at who you are, to honestly appraise not only your flaws and limitations, your faults, but also your strengths and your gifts. How can you be better used to usher in the reign of God? Maybe an image of your pastor with a shoe brush and a shoe will help. And hey, if you want a lesson, Saturday I've got shoes to be polished.